So today I'm going to look at a question that has interested many historians and the general public, especially about the Punic War. And this is a war that was fought between Rome and Carthage, and the war went on for close to 100 years. It started around 250 BCE and it went on to close to 100 BCE, close to 150 BCE or around that time. So it's a war that went on for a very long time. And this war has been described as we could say one of the biggest wars to ever been fought by humans. It's that big. It's a war that is often it comes close to the First and Second World War. Now, this is a war that started because of the expansion of two empires during this time. We are talking about Rome, ancient Rome, and Carthage. Carthage was an empire that was founded at the northern part of Africa, and it was founded by immigrants who came from Asia or the region we know today as Palestine, probably that region, or the northern part, maybe Turkey. We can't know for sure. The Phoenicians, they were the tribe that went to North Africa and started this empire. Now, uh, during the war started before the birth of Hannibal, who happens to be the one person who is often associated with the war, or when the Punic War is mentioned, the name Hannibal almost always comes up. But the war started before the birth of Hannibal. And when this war started, ancient Rome managed to take away two islands that had been occupied by Carthage, and that is Sardinia and Sicily. Now, these islands are very close to the Italian peninsula. And for that reason, even though Rome had not expanded to cover the entire Italian peninsula, when Carthage came and took these two islands, when it did so, it felt like these two islands were basically supposed to be its property, basically. And when the war broke out, the Romans managed to push out the Carthaginians from the two islands. And this didn't, of course, the Carthaginians were not happy about this. And we are told that the father of Hannibal, who went by the name Hamilcar, was so distraught, was so angry about it, was so disappointed that Carthage had lost these two islands. And at one point, he took Hannibal to some form of religious rituals, and he made him to promise that he was going to punish Rome for doing this. Now, the the biggest event, or one of the biggest events that happened as in preparation for Hannibal's attack on Rome, was the crossing of the Alps. This is a huge mountain range in the northern part of the Italian peninsula. Uh, Given its how it's formed, it's kind of like a natural wall between the rest of Europe and the Italian peninsula. So the ancients used to consider it to be a very difficult part of land to cross. And in fact, some used to believe that the mountains stretch up to the sky, to heavens, in fact. So that's how enormous they saw it to be. So, but Hannibal decides to cross this mountain range, and this turned out to be a very smart move, because up until that moment, Rome and Carthage were fighting, but Romans somehow always managed to control the advances of Carthage, and Hannibal in particular. Hannibal decides he doesn't want to fight the war outside of the Italian peninsula. He feels like it is going to work better if he takes the war to the Romans. And he decides to cross this mountain range. Now, the reason, now, historians over time are wondering, how did he manage to cross this mountain range? Because and one of those people who managed to write down very detailed description of how Hannibal managed to cross the Alps is Titus Livius. This is the ancient Roman historian. Now, I should point out that Livy lived between 59 and 17 AD, 59 BCE and 17 AD, sorry. And that's close to 200 years after the Punic War was fought, and in particular after Hannibal had crossed the Alps. So the question that arises is, how was Titus Livius able to provide so detailed description of that event, given that he was not there? In fact, he was born close to 200 years later. And he managed to give a so detailed description in his work, from the founding of the city, or Ab Urbe Condita. And but he does provide explanations on how he came to get the information about about Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. Now, he tells us that he gets much of the information from records that were made by other historians, especially people who are alive during that time. There are people who did keep records. And in particular, he does mention about Romans who were captured by Hannibal. Seems like before Hannibal crossed the Alps, he did capture some Romans during the fights that happened between him and the Romans, especially in Spain, in the region we know today, Spain, that region. He did fight with Romans there, and seems like he did capture some Romans and made them prisoners of war. And he goes with them to, he travels with them. Now, one of the people Titus Livius mentions is somebody who went by the name Lucius Cincius Alimentus. Now, Alimentus happened to have been one of the prisoners of war that was traveling. He was a Roman who had been captured by Hannibal, and he happened to have been traveling with Hannibal and his army as he was crossing the Alps. Now, uh, Alimentus provides very specific details about the crossing of the Alps by Hannibal, and this is what this is what Titus writes about what Lucius Cincius Alimentus says. He says, or this is what he says about Lucius Alimentus as he describes him as a source. He says, Lucius Cincius Alimentus tells us that he was taken prisoner by Hannibal, and I should be most inclined to accept his authority if he had not confused the numbers by adding in the Gauls and Ligurians. If these are included, there were 80,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Now, this is the first time he mentions this individual, and he mentions this individual while trying to explain the number of soldiers that accompanied Hannibal to Italy. Now, he also mentions, he tells us, now, of course, he goes into talking about these numbers, and it's not known, or he doesn't get the actual number or an agreed upon number of the number of soldiers that accompanied Hannibal to Italy. And he writes, he says that the sources provided varying numbers, and he says the authorities are hopelessly at variance as to the number of the troops with which Hannibal entered Italy. The highest estimate assigns him 100,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry. The lowest puts his strength at 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. So even his sources were not, we can say, either not very accurate, or different sources provided different pieces of information regarding Hannibal crossing the Alps. Um, but despite all that, he does provide what I would say could be one of the most detailed description of what was happening. For example, he tells us about the apprehension that existed among Hannibal's soldiers as well as they were approaching the Alps. It's not like they were confident of crossing it. Seems like they were so worried and they were anxious about the crossing. Livy tells us that, but the sight of the Alps revived the terrors in the minds of his men. Although rumor, which generally magnifies untrue dangers, had filled them with gloomy foreboding, the nearer view proved much more fearful. The height of the mountain now so close, the snow which was almost lost in the sky, and the wretched huts perched on the rocks, the flocks and herds shriveled and stunted in the cold, the men wild and unkempt, and everything animate and inanimate, stiff with frost, together with other sights dreadful beyond description. So as the soldiers come close to the Alps, as they are approaching it from the north, they came from west, coming to east, and then they are going to the south. Now they need to cross the Alps and then enter the Italian peninsula. They are coming close to the Alps, and the soldiers are not very confident, and they are worried, they are anxious. They've heard stories about the Alps. And will you pick something from this description that the Alps was occupied, or not really occupied? There were people or small tribes that lived on the mountains, so it wasn't like it was completely not occupied. There were people who were used to staying in that environment, and they had built small huts, and they were living there with their animals. But Livy tells us that Hannibal was aware of these worries of his soldiers, and it seems like he was very good at making his soldiers to be at ease. Of course, that's one of the things that make him one of the greatest generals. He was able to read the mood among his soldiers, and he was able to make them relax and be confident and be ready to face whatever was coming their way. And Livy does write down a speech that he gives, and he gives this in is a quote, exact quote, in fact, that the things he tells his soldiers, and this is what he tells them. This is Hannibal talking to his soldiers, addressing his soldiers as they are very close to the Alps. They are just below it. He says, now that you are within sight of the Alps, on the other side of which lies Italy, you have become weary and are arresting your march in the very gates of the enemy. What do you imagine the Alps to be other than lofty mountains? Suppose them to be higher than the peaks of the Pyrenees. Surely no region in the world can touch the sky or be impassable to man. Even the Alps are inhabited and cultivated. Animals are bred and reared there. Their gorges and ravines can be transferred by armies. Why even the envoys why? Even the envoys whom you see here did not cross the Alps by flying through the air, nor were their ancestors native to the soil. They came into Italy as immigrants looking for a land to settle in, and they crossed the Alps often in immense bodies with their wives and children and all their belongings. So he's telling his soldiers, look, it's not like nobody has crossed these mountains. People cross them. There are people living on them. So why are you so afraid of the Alps? And he tries to remove or to get rid of some of the rumors these people have had. For example, some of them believe that these mountains touch the heavens, and he tells them there is no mountain anywhere that touches the heavens, and there is no mountain that cannot be crossed by humans. So he's trying to make them see the possibility that they can cross this mountain, and it looks like they believe him, but they had to pay a huge price for that, and we're going to look at that as we go along. Now, now there were these tribes that lived near the Alps, especially the Gauls, you can say the French today, or tribes that later on became part of the French community or society. And these tribes, Livy decides to form friendship with them because he knew they knew the environment better, and they would give him guides. And indeed, they did provide him with guides who help his soldiers figure out where to go and how to deal with the obstacles that stood before them. Now, here's the thing. While these guides did help Hannibal, some of these guides were not trustworthy. Some of them ended up misleading him, misleading his soldiers, and sometimes they will waste a lot of time going the wrong way because these guides were doing it purposely because they didn't want him to cross the Alps. And then sometimes they will put traps for his army. Livy does describes this in detail, that these guides were working with some of these tribes who lived on the mountains, and these tribes will attack the Hannibal's soldiers. And while Hannibal, it looks like Hannibal had this relationship with these tribes, it was sometimes friendly, sometimes not so friendly, and he himself did also harm the tribes. Livy tells us that he will raid their villages for food, take away their animals in particular, so that his army can have something to eat. And this is what Livy writes. He says, he then seized fortified village, the head place of the district, together with some adjacent hamlets, and from the food and cattle thus secured, he provided his army with rations for 3 days. So while he wanted these tribes to be friendly, there were reasons why these tribes would also not like to be friendly to him, because on one hand he would want to be friendly to them, and indeed he did help some of them settle disputes amongst them. Livy does talk about this. But on the other hand, he will, when he didn't have food for his soldiers, he will raid their villages and take away their food. So for the most part, these tribes seems like they continued attacking Hannibal and his army as he climbed the Alps. But it seems like they were not strong enough to do any major damage to him. And Livy tells us, in fact, this, besides that, or what worried Hannibal the most was the ability to cross the elephants over. The elephants are huge animals, and he did have a lot of problems trying to have them cross. And Livy writes, he says, the elephants caused considerable delay owing to the difficulty of getting them through the narrow or prestigious places. On the other hand, they rendered that part of the column safe from attack where they were, for the natives were unaccustomed to the sight of them and had a great dread of going too near them. So Livy tells us that it took 9 days for Hannibal to reach the summit, the highest point of the Alps. And while there, they had to rest, and he decided that they were going to take 2 days to rest on the mountain. But Livy tells us that this rest was not anything close to rest, because there was no food, it was extremely cold, the animals were starving, the army, the men were starving, and Hannibal had to, again, it looks like he was very good with persuading people, because Livy does tell us that he would talk to his soldiers, he would tell them, we are close, we are almost there, and this is going to be a huge win for us. And then after 2 days, they started to go down. And Livy tells us that this turned out to be the most difficult part of the journey. This is where Hannibal lost the most animals and soldiers, not to any attacks, but simply by they were falling and going down and dying, and there was also, of course, the lack of food. And Hannibal did lose a lot of people here, and I'm going to mention some numbers that Livy gives us about the losses that he incurred in terms of the army especially. And they will go down, and Livy tells us that almost the whole of the way was precipitous, narrow, and slippery, so that they were unable to keep their footing, and if they sleep, they could not recover themselves. They kept falling over each other, and the baggage animals rolled over on their driver. So animals rolling downhill, soldiers, and it's cold, there is no food, and but they still managed to continue climbing down. And looks like Hannibal had engineers who would help create paths. For example, Livy tells us that there was at some point where they could not figure out how they would climb down, and these engineers came up with ways to develop a. So Livy writes, the soldiers were told off to cut through it. They built up against it an enormous pile of tall trees, which they had felled and lopped. And when the wind was strong enough, uh, to blow up the fire, they set light to the pile. When the rock was red hot, they poured vinegar upon it to disintegrate it. After that, treating it by fire, they opened a way through it with their tools and eased the steep slope by winding tracks of moderate gradient, so that not only the baggage animals but even the elephants could be laid down. So Hannibal had these engineers who, when things were difficult, they knew, or they did find ways to create paths and to remove obstacles. So looks like he did use great skill to have his army and animals across the Alps. So it took 15 days for to reach Italy, from the beginning of climbing and coming down. And Livy tells us that that came considering, or from the numbers that Cincius, the guy I mentioned earlier, Cincius says that he had Hannibal himself say that he had lost close to 36,000 men. So that's how many people died during the crossing of the Alps. So it was a huge loss, and these are just people. Of course, he must have lost a lot of animals, and supplies, of course. And we also have to count that he must have done a lot of damage to the tribes that lived on the mountain or near the mountain by raiding them and taking away their animals. So this is the conclusion from Livy. Such in the main was the way in which they reached Italy. 5 months, according to some authorities, after leaving New Carthage. 15 days of which was spent in overcoming the difficulties of the Alps. So that's the entire time it took. It took 15 days, but then it took 5 months since they left. I think New Carthage was like Spain or some part around there. So it took them 5 months in total, but 15 days to cross the Alps, and they lost close to 36,000 people. And of course, that crossing became the beginning of the biggest, the most ferocious and destructive part of the Punic War. Thank you for watching.